During the second half of the 19th century, France established a colony of French Indochina in Southeast Asia that included the modern-day countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. France exported its language, education, religion, and some economic development to its colony in exchange for the exploitation of local wealth such as natural resources and labor. The Japanese invasion of French Indochina during World War II ended French colonial rule. During the Japanese occupation of Vietnam, many Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh, fought for their freedom with support from the United States. The Japanese surrender at the end of World War II marked the end of Japan's occupation of Vietnam. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared the new Democratic Republic of Vietnam to be an independent country. Vietnam today celebrates September 2nd as its Independence Day. France sent troops to Vietnam to try to stop Vietnam from becoming independent. This resulted in the French Indochina War that began in September 1945 and ended with a peace treaty called the Geneva Accords, signed in July 1954. The Geneva Accords provided that all French troops would depart Vietnam by 1956 and that Vietnam then would choose its own government through national elections. The Cold War prevented the Geneva Accords from being implemented. National elections were never held. Instead, Vietnam was divided into two separate countries, a communist North Vietnam supported by the Soviet Union and China, and an anti-communist South Vietnam supported by the United States and its allies. North Vietnam did not accept the legitimacy of the government in South Vietnam. In turn, the United States was determined to stop the spread of communism from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. The stage was set for the Vietnam War. U.S. policy in the Vietnam War was driven by the so-called Domino theory first expressed by President Eisenhower in 1954. The Domino theory predicted that if one country, such as South Vietnam, fell to communism, neighboring countries would fall too, like a row of dominoes. Under the Domino theory, the fight for control of South Vietnam was therefore a fight to determine whether communism would spread to all of Southeast Asia. This was seen as a fight not only for the freedom of South Vietnam, but also for the freedom of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and other neighboring countries. Those who rejected the Domino theory often viewed United States foreign policy in South Vietnam to be a mistake. According to this opposing view, the fight for control of South Vietnam was a fight for the right of the Vietnamese to choose their own form of government, free from foreign interference. Those who rejected the Domino theory planted the seeds for what later became the largest anti-war protests in American history. From the founding of South Vietnam in 1955 through 1964, the United States limited its involvement in the Vietnam War primarily to providing training and support for South Vietnam's new military. South Vietnam's military initially held its own against the local South Vietnam insurgents called the Viet Cong, but once North Vietnam began sending its regular army troops south to join the battle, it became clear that the South Vietnamese military would be defeated unless the United States became more involved. In August 1964, North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked two United States Navy destroyers offshore from North Vietnam in a body of water called the Gulf of Tonkin. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution authorizing President Johnson to defend United States forces in the region. Congress never declared war against North Vietnam, but the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was interpreted to provide legal justification for President Johnson to order direct military action by the United States against North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. The United States began bombing North Vietnam and sent American ground troops to Vietnam in 1965 after passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. By 1968, the United States had more than 500,000 troops in South Vietnam. Many of these troops were drafted or volunteered to avoid the draft. Controversies surrounding the fairness of the draft added energy to anti-war protests. U.S. political and military leadership assured the American people in 1967 that the United States was winning the war in Vietnam and that the worst of the fighting was over. Imagine the shock of the American people, therefore, when the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong escalated the fighting by attacking more than 100 cities from one end of South Vietnam to the other, all on the same day. This attack came to be known as the 1968 Tet Offensive because it started on the first day of Vietnam's New Year or Tet holiday. The 1968 Tet Offensive is considered the psychological turning point for American public support to continue fighting in Vietnam. President Johnson's credibility was so damaged by the 1968 Tet Offensive that he decided not to run for re-election that year. President Nixon was elected instead in 1968 with a pledge to find an honorable end to the Vietnam War. President Nixon's approach to the Vietnam War was to begin withdrawing American troops from South Vietnam in 1969 and to transfer more of the fighting and other responsibility for the war to the South Vietnamese government. This approach was known as Vietnamization. By 1972, there were fewer than 100,000 American troops still in South Vietnam compared with more than 1 million South Vietnamese troops. The United States, North Vietnam, and other parties signed a treaty called the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973. This treaty called for an end to all fighting, the complete withdrawal of remaining U.S. forces, the release of all American prisoners, and South Vietnam's right to peaceful self-determination. The Paris Peace Accords brought direct American involvement in the Vietnam War to a close. North Vietnam violated its obligations under the Paris Peace Accords by resuming its fight against South Vietnam in 1973 before the last American troops had even left Vietnam. After the United States stopped supporting South Vietnam, North Vietnam captured South Vietnam's capital of Saigon on April 30th, 1975, ending the war and reunifying Vietnam under communist rule. The United States suffered horrendous casualties during the Vietnam War. More than 58,000 Americans were killed. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, killed, or otherwise harmed by post-traumatic stress or by the herbicide called Agent Orange that the United States sprayed on the jungle in Vietnam. Were these casualties incurred for a good cause? Historians and other scholars disagree today whether the United States was justified going to war in Vietnam. Experts who believe the war was a mistake point out that after North Vietnam defeated South Vietnam, communism did not spread throughout Southeast Asia as predicted by the Domino theory. Vietnam instead fought wars against two other communist countries, China and Cambodia, after the Vietnam War ended. Some say this proves that even though North Vietnam and the Viet Cong were communists, they were fighting for the independence of Vietnam rather than to spread communism globally. Those who support the U.S. decision to fight in the Vietnam War point out that the status of the Cold War was very different in the 1980s after the Vietnam War concluded than it was in the 1950s when the United States adopted the domino theory. By the 1980s, it was clear that life in democracies with market economies and individual freedoms like South Korea, Taiwan, Western Europe, the United States, and Japan was far superior to life in communist societies with no private enterprise and few individual freedoms like North Korea, China, Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and Cuba. According to this view, the United States stopped the spread of communism in Southeast Asia long enough for the advantages of democracy over communism to become more visible. The Vietnam War bought time for other Southeast Asian countries to strengthen their economies and raise their standard of living to help reduce the appeal of communism. The end of the Cold War already was in sight by the 1980s. The wall dividing Germany into two countries was torn down in 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Although Vietnam is still ruled today by an unelected communist government, it adopted a new constitution in 1992 that permitted private enterprise and introduced a market economy. Since adopting these economic reforms, Vietnam has become one of Southeast Asia's fastest growing economies and a strong trading partner with the United States. It may be fair to say that although North Vietnam eventually defeated South Vietnam on the battlefield during the Vietnam War, Vietnam's economic transformation shows how the United States won the peace that followed the war. The valor, service, and sacrifice of our Vietnam veterans is sometimes lost in the controversy about whether the United States should have sent American troops to Vietnam. One tragedy of the Vietnam War is that many Americans who opposed U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War harassed and abused Vietnam veterans when they returned home instead of giving them the thanks and honor they deserved. This makes no sense, but it happened across the United States. Many of our Vietnam veterans today are in their 70s and 80s. They are all battlefield winners and freedom fighters. Before it is too late, thank them for their service, honor them as battlefield winners, and welcome them home.